10 R&B stars who became homeless. They filled arenas, topped charts, and shaped the sound of generations. Yet when the music stopped, some of these R&B legends were left without protection, stability, or even a place to call home. Fame promised everything, but delivered nothing when it mattered most. These are not rumors or exaggerations. They are documented truths the industry rarely wants you to remember. On Black Excellence Legends, we go beyond the hits to expose what happens after the spotlight fades. Stay with us until the end, because these stories will change how you view success forever. And as you listen, ask yourself, should legends ever be allowed to disappear like this? Share your thoughts in the comments. David Ruffin. David Ruffin was one of the most electrifying voices in the history of soul music, and also one of its most tragic cautionary tales. As the unmistakable lead singer of the Temptations during their golden era, Ruffin helped define the Motown sound of the 1960s. His raw, pleading tenor powered classics like My Girl, Ain't Too Proud to Beg, and I Wish It Would Rain, songs that continue to shape American music decades later. At his peak, Ruffin was not just a singer, he was the emotional engine of one of the most successful vocal groups of all time. Between 1964 and 1968, the Temptations scored 4 #1 hits on the Billboard Hot 100, with Ruffin's voice front and center. The group toured internationally, sold millions of records, and became cultural ambassadors of Black excellence. Yet behind the tailored suits and synchronized choreography, Ruffin's personal life was unraveling. Fame amplified long-standing struggles with drug addiction, particularly cocaine, which began to affect his reliability, finances, and relationships. In 1968, Ruffin was fired from the Temptations after repeated missed performances, internal conflicts, and escalating substance abuse. The decision marked a turning point. While Ruffin attempted a solo career and achieved moderate success, including a Grammy nomination, he never regained the stability or commercial power he once had. As record deals dried up and legal troubles mounted, his income became inconsistent, and financial mismanagement worsened the situation. By the late 1970s and 1980s, Ruffin's life reflected a painful contradiction: a legendary voice paired with increasing instability. According to multiple documented accounts, he experienced periods of housing insecurity, relying on friends, temporary arrangements, and unstable living conditions rather than permanent residence. This was not the image of the Motown superstar the public remembered, but it was the reality of an artist the industry had largely moved on from. Ruffin's health deteriorated as addiction intensified. On June 1, 1991, he collapsed in Los Angeles after a night of heavy drug use. Toxicology reports later confirmed a fatal overdose involving cocaine, and he died at the age of 50. His death was not the result of poverty alone, but of a system that offered fame without protection, success without support, and little compassion once the spotlight faded. What makes David Ruffin's story especially painful is how preventable much of it was. At a time when mental health treatment, addiction support, and financial guidance for Black artists were virtually non-existent, Ruffin was left to navigate fame's pressures alone. The same industry that profited from his voice failed to safeguard his humanity. Today, David Ruffin is remembered primarily for his music, but remembering only the hits risks ignoring the lesson. His life exposes how easily brilliance can be discarded once it becomes inconvenient. He was not just a fallen star. He was a man whose talent outpaced the support structures around him. David Ruffin's legacy is both magnificent and haunting. His voice lives forever, but his story reminds us that legend does not guarantee security, and fame does not protect against being forgotten. Sly Stone. Sly Stone, born Sylvester Stewart, was a revolutionary force who changed the sound, look, and philosophy of popular music, only to become one of its most painful examples of how brilliance can be abandoned once success collapses. As the leader of Sly and the Family Stone, he helped invent a new musical language in the late 1960s, blending funk, soul, rock, and psychedelia while presenting one of the first racially integrated, gender-inclusive bands in mainstream America. Between 1967 and 1971, Sly Stone reached extraordinary heights. The group scored multiple top 10 hits, including Dance to the Music, Everyday People, Thank You, Fallet in Me Be Myself, Again, and Family Affair. Their 1969 performance at Woodstock is still considered one of the most influential live moments in rock history. Commercially, they sold millions of records, while culturally, they symbolize unity during one of the most divided periods in U.S. history. But success came with intense pressure. By the early 1970s, Sly Stone's relationship with fame, control, and substance use had deteriorated. Chronic drug addiction, particularly cocaine and PCP, led to missed shows, studio isolation, paranoia, and broken trust with band members and record executives. Albums were delayed for years, tours collapsed, and the group slowly disintegrated. What once felt visionary began to feel erratic to an industry that quickly loses patience. Financial instability followed artistic decline. Despite the wealth generated during his peak years, poor management, legal disputes, and unpaid royalties drained Stone's resources. By the late 2000s, reports confirmed that Sly Stone was living out of a camper van in Los Angeles, moving between parking lots and relying on friends. This was not rumor or exaggeration. It was verified by journalists who interviewed him directly. A man who once headlined global stages no longer had permanent housing. Stone later explained that trust had been repeatedly broken by managers, labels, and systems that profited from his genius, but failed to protect him once his behavior no longer fit commercial expectations. Unlike myths that portray his situation as a choice or rebellion, the reality was more complex. Addiction, exploitation, and abandonment combined into long-term housing insecurity. In the 2010s, renewed public interest brought some recognition. In 2015, a lawsuit awarded Stone $5 million in unpaid royalties, although legal complications limited what he ultimately received. Sporadic appearances in interviews reminded audiences that the architect of funk was still alive, but far removed from the life his music helped build for others. Sly Stone's story forces uncomfortable questions. How does someone who reshaped global music end up without stable shelter? Why are innovators celebrated for impact, but discarded for vulnerability? His life illustrates how the music industry often mistakes talent for invincibility and leaves artists unprotected once success fades. Sly Stone did not just make hit records. He created a blueprint for modern funk, hip-hop, and pop collaboration. Yet his housing instability stands as a stark reminder that cultural influence does not guarantee security. Remembering him honestly means honoring both his revolutionary genius and the systems that failed to care for it once the spotlight moved on. Bobby Womack. Bobby Womack was one of the most emotionally honest voices in soul music. A songwriter, guitarist, and singer whose work blurred the line between confession and performance. Born in 1944 in Cleveland, Ohio, Womack grew up immersed in gospel, learning music in church alongside his brothers. That foundation shaped an artist whose sound carried raw vulnerability rather than polish, setting him apart in an industry often built on image. Womack's early career accelerated quickly. As a teenager, he performed with the Valentinos, mentored by Sam Cooke, who recognized his songwriting talent. After Cooke's death in 1964, Womack's life took a controversial turn when he married Cooke's widow, a decision that damaged his reputation and altered how the industry viewed him. While his songwriting flourished, public scrutiny followed him relentlessly. Throughout the late 1960s and 1970s, Bobby Womack became a hitmaker behind the scenes and in front of the microphone. He wrote It's All Over Now, later made famous by the Rolling Stones, and delivered solo classics like Across 11th Street, Woman's Gotta Have It, and If You Think You're Lonely Now. His songs were gritty, street-level reflections of pain, love, regret, and survival, often mirroring his own life. Despite commercial success, Womack struggled with long-term drug addiction, particularly cocaine, which eroded both his health and financial stability. Earnings from songwriting and touring were often offset by legal issues, poor money management, and exploitative contracts common for Black artists of his generation. As record sales declined and personal chaos intensified, stability slipped further out of reach. By the 1980s and 1990s, Womack's life was marked by repeated setbacks. In interviews, he openly admitted to periods of housing instability, relying on friends, temporary living arrangements, and unstable conditions rather than permanent residence. This was not a permanent state of street homelessness, but it reflected a profound fall from fame. A legendary songwriter without consistent security in an industry that had profited heavily from his work. Health challenges compounded these struggles. Womack battled diabetes, cancer, and the long-term effects of addiction later in life. Yet even in decline, his artistry endured. In 2012, he released The Bravest Man in the Universe, a critically acclaimed album that introduced his voice to a new generation and proved that creative relevance does not expire with youth. Bobby Womack died in 2014 at the age of 70. His death closed the chapter on a career filled with brilliance and contradiction. What makes his story especially revealing is how normalized his hardship became, how easily the industry accepted his decline while continuing to benefit from his catalog. Womack's life exposes a harsh reality. Talent alone does not guarantee protection. His housing instability was not the result of obscurity, but of systemic neglect, addiction, and an industry unwilling to safeguard artists once their commercial peak passed. Remembering Bobby Womack means honoring more than his hits. It means acknowledging the cost of unfiltered honesty in an unforgiving system, and recognizing that some of soul music's deepest truths were sung by a man who often lived without the security his legacy deserved. Cuba Gooding Sr. Cuba Gooding Sr. was a soul singer whose voice once dominated the airwaves, only to fade into instability as the industry moved on. Born in 1944, he rose to fame as the lead vocalist of the R&B group, The Main Ingredient, whose smooth harmonies and romantic storytelling defined early 1970s soul. Their signature hit, Everybody Plays the Fool, reached number 3 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1972 and sold millions of copies, cementing Gooding as one of the most recognizable voices of the era. At the height of his success, Gooding lived the life many artists dream of: national tours, television appearances, and steady radio rotation. The Main Ingredient followed their breakout single with other charting songs like Just Don't Want to Be Lonely, building a catalog that remains influential in classic R&B circles. For a brief window, financial security and public admiration seemed guaranteed. But the music industry is rarely built for longevity, especially for artists without strong financial protection. As musical trends shifted in the late 1970s, the Main Ingredient's commercial momentum slowed. Royalties diminished, touring opportunities became inconsistent, and income stability eroded. Like many artists of his generation, Gooding faced contracts that favored labels over performers, leaving little long-term safety once hits stopped charting. Personal struggles compounded professional decline. Over time, substance abuse began to affect Gooding's health and judgment, further destabilizing his finances and relationships. According to documented accounts and interviews, there were periods when he experienced housing insecurity, living without a fixed residence, and relying on temporary arrangements rather than permanent stability. While not always living on the streets, his situation represented a dramatic fall from the success he once enjoyed. Gooding's later years were marked by volatility. In 2017, he was found dead in a parked car in Los Angeles. Toxicology reports later confirmed that his death was caused by multiple drug intoxication, including cocaine and alcohol. He was 72 years old. His passing shocked many fans who remembered him only through his classic recordings, unaware of the hardship that had followed his early fame. What makes Cuba Gooding Sr.'s story particularly sobering is how common it is. He was not untalented, irresponsible, or forgotten by accident. His experience reflects a broader pattern in which Black R&B artists were celebrated during their commercial peak, but left without structural support once the spotlight shifted. Financial literacy, mental health resources, and addiction treatment were rarely provided, even as labels continued to profit from their catalogs. Today, Gooding's voice still plays on radio stations and streaming platforms, often without acknowledgement of the man behind it or the cost of his journey. His legacy lives on not only through his music, but also through the cautionary truth his life reveals. Success without protection is temporary, and fame does not equal security. Remembering Cuba Gooding Sr. honestly means recognizing both sides of his story, the joy his music brought to millions, and the vulnerability he faced once the industry stopped calling. His life stands as a reminder that talent alone is never enough in a system that offers applause instead of care. Chico DeBarge. Chico DeBarge is one of the most haunting examples of raw talent colliding with generational trauma and an unforgiving music industry. Born Jonathan Arthur DeBarge in 1966, Chico was the youngest male member of the famous DeBarge family, a musical dynasty that produced multiple R&B hits in the 1980s. While his siblings found success as a group, Chico emerged as a solo artist whose emotional vulnerability set him apart almost immediately. His breakthrough came in 1986 with the hit single "Talk to Me," produced by Prince. The song climbed into the top 10 of the R&B charts and introduced Chico as a distinct voice, soft, romantic, and introspective. Unlike the polished pop sound of his brothers, Chico's music leaned inward, often reflecting loneliness, longing, and emotional pain. Critics praised his honesty, but the industry was less prepared to protect an artist so exposed. Behind the scenes, Chico was battling demons far larger than fame. Growing up in a household marked by physical abuse, instability, and exposure to drugs, he developed a heroin addiction while still a teenager. By the time his solo career gained momentum, addiction had already tightened its grip. In 1988, Chico was arrested and later sentenced to 4 years in prison on drug-related charges, abruptly halting his rise. When he was released in the early 1990s, the music industry had moved on. Record deals vanished, public attention faded, and the safety net that once surrounded his family was gone. Chico relapsed repeatedly, cycling through recovery attempts while struggling to rebuild his career. During this period, he experienced documented homelessness, living on the streets of Los Angeles and relying on shelters and temporary accommodations. This was not speculation. Chico later confirmed it himself in interviews, describing nights without shelter and the humiliation of being recognized while having nowhere to go. What makes Chico DeBarge's story especially painful is how visible his suffering was, yet how little institutional help followed. His addiction was treated as a personal failure rather than the result of trauma and neglect. Financial mismanagement, lack of artist development support, and minimal mental health resources left him exposed once his commercial value declined. In the 2000s, Chico made several attempts at recovery and creative rebirth. He released new music, appeared in interviews, and spoke openly about his struggles, offering rare insight into the psychological cost of fame without healing. While he never fully reclaimed mainstream success, his honesty earned respect from fans who saw him as a survivor rather than a cautionary tale. Chico DeBarge is still alive today, carrying both the weight of his past and the resilience of endurance. His story forces a difficult question. How many gifted artists are lost, not because they lack talent, but because no one taught them how to survive success? Remembering Chico DeBarge is not about pity, it is about accountability. His life exposes how generational trauma, addiction, and industry abandonment can intersect to push even the most gifted voices into homelessness. He stands as a reminder that talent can open doors, but healing is what keeps them from closing forever. Billy Preston. Billy Preston was a musical prodigy whose talent placed him at the center of some of the most historic moments in popular music. Yet his later years revealed how even extraordinary success can collapse without protection. Born in 1946 in Houston, Texas, Preston displayed remarkable musical ability at an early age, mastering piano and organ as a child, and performing publicly before he was 10. Gospel music shaped his foundation, grounding his sound in emotion and technical brilliance. Preston's career trajectory was almost unmatched. As a teenager, he toured with Little Richard, gaining exposure to professional musicianship while still developing his own identity. By the late 1960s, Preston had become a sought-after keyboardist, working with artists across genres. His most famous association came with the Beatles, who affectionately referred to him as the fifth Beatle. Preston's keyboard work on Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, and other sessions helped stabilize a band on the brink of collapse. He was the only musician ever credited as a featured artist on a Beatles single. Beyond collaboration, Preston enjoyed significant solo success. Songs like Will It Go Round in Circles and Nothing from Nothing reached #1. One on the Billboard Hot 100, proving he was not just a supporting player, but a star in his own right. He won multiple Grammy Awards, including recognition for gospel recordings that reflected his spiritual roots. At his peak, Preston appeared financially secure, creatively fulfilled, and universally respected. However, the pressures of constant touring, fame, and unresolved personal struggles took a toll. Over time, substance abuse began to erode Preston's stability. Legal issues, health complications, and poor financial oversight gradually drained his resources. Like many artists of his era, Preston lacked long-term financial protection, despite generating immense value for the industry. By the 1990s, Preston's situation had shifted dramatically. Income from performances became inconsistent, and health problems limited his ability to tour. According to documented accounts, he experienced periods of housing instability, relying on friends, temporary arrangements, and short-term living situations rather than a permanent home. While he was not consistently living on the streets, the contrast between his former success and later vulnerability was stark. In 2006, after years of declining health, Billy Preston died at the age of 59, following complications related to kidney failure. His passing prompted renewed reflection on his immense contribution to music and the quiet hardship that followed his most celebrated years. What makes Billy Preston's story especially revealing is how easily brilliance can be absorbed and forgotten. His keyboard work shaped rock, soul, and gospel music. Yet his personal safety net was fragile once his commercial momentum slowed. The industry continued to benefit from his recordings long after his support systems disappeared. Remembering Billy Preston means recognizing both his joy and his struggle. He was a bridge between genres, a collaborator trusted by legends, and a solo artist who reached the top of the charts. Yet his later housing instability reminds us that talent does not guarantee security, and that even those who help create musical history can be left without stability when the applause fades. Billy Preston didn't just play music, he carried it. And his life stands as a reminder that carrying the sound of an era does not always mean being protected by it. Lauryn Hill. Lauryn Hill stands as one of the most gifted artists of her generation. Yet her story also reveals how fame can coexist with instability when systems fail to protect creative labor. Rising in the mid-1990s as a member of the Fugees, Hill helped redefine hip-hop and R&B by blending lyricism, melody, and social consciousness. The group's album, The Score, sold over 17 million copies worldwide, making Hill a global figure almost overnight. In 1998, Hill released The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, an album that reshaped popular music. It debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200, earned 5 Grammy Awards in a single night, and remains one of the most acclaimed albums in modern history. At that moment, Hill was not only commercially dominant, she was culturally defining. Success at that level suggested permanence and financial security. Yet the reality proved more complicated. Following intense public scrutiny, creative disputes, and pressure from industry structures she openly criticized, Hill withdrew from mainstream visibility. Touring slowed, new releases became rare, and her relationship with the music industry grew increasingly adversarial. Unlike narratives that frame her retreat as self-destruction, Hill repeatedly described it as self-preservation within a system she felt exploited artists, particularly Black women, without regard for mental health or autonomy. Financial instability emerged not from lack of success, but from complex legal and financial issues. Between 2005 and 2012, Hill failed to pay federal income taxes on earnings totaling more than $1.8 million. She later pleaded guilty and served 3 months in federal prison, followed by home confinement. Court records confirm that the case stemmed from mismanagement rather than insolvency, but the consequences were severe. During this period, Hill faced housing insecurity, including documented risks of foreclosure and eviction related to unpaid obligations. Importantly, this did not involve street homelessness. However, it reflected a fragile reality rarely associated with artists of her stature. The contrast was stark. A Grammy-dominating musician confronting the possibility of losing her home, while her catalog continued to generate revenue for others. Hill's situation underscores a broader pattern within the music industry. Revenue streams can be fragmented, accounting opaque, and support minimal once artists step outside expected commercial behavior. For women, especially Black women, asserting creative control often comes at a financial cost. Hill's case illustrates how instability can arise even at the highest levels of success when infrastructure prioritizes profit over sustainability. In the years since, Hill has continued to perform sporadically, drawing devoted audiences worldwide. Her influence remains undeniable, sampled, cited, and studied across genres. Yet her story resists a simple arc of triumph or collapse. It is a reminder that artistic legacy does not automatically translate into long-term security. Remembering Lauryn Hill within the context of housing instability is not about diminishing her achievements. It is about acknowledging that fame is not a safety net, and that even icons can face vulnerability when systems fail to protect the people who create cultural value. Her life invites a necessary question. If an artist of her impact can face instability, what protections truly exist for everyone else? Terrell Carter. Terrell Carter is a powerful example of how success is often preceded by invisible struggle, and how homelessness can exist long before fame ever arrives. Born in 1970, Carter pursued music and performance with determination, but his path was anything but secure. Long before audiences recognized his voice or acting talent, he faced a reality that few associate with entertainers: having no stable place to live. In his early adulthood, while trying to establish himself in music and theater, Carter experienced documented homelessness. With limited resources and no industry connections, he slept in public spaces, including libraries and shelters, using daytime hours to rehearse, write, and plan auditions. This period was marked not by idleness, but by survival. Carter later described homelessness as emotionally exhausting, not only because of physical insecurity, but because of the constant need to remain invisible in public spaces. Carter's breakthrough came gradually rather than overnight. He built a reputation as a stage performer and R&B vocalist, eventually gaining recognition through theater and later television. His most notable exposure came from his work with Tyler Perry, where he appeared in stage productions and screen projects that introduced him to a wider audience. These roles brought visibility, but more importantly, they brought stability, something Carter had lived without for years. Unlike many narratives that portray homelessness as a permanent downward spiral, Carter's story highlights the role of persistence and discipline. He maintained vocal training, physical conditioning, and professional focus even while lacking housing. When opportunities arrived, he was prepared, not lucky. That distinction matters. His later success was built on groundwork laid during his most unstable years. As his career progressed, Carter expanded beyond performance. He became a speaker, minister, and advocate, openly discussing his experiences with homelessness, faith, and resilience. Rather than distancing himself from his past, he incorporated it into his public identity. His honesty challenged stereotypes that frame homelessness as laziness or lack of ambition. In Carter's case, it existed alongside talent, work ethic, and vision. What makes Terrell Carter's story especially relevant to this discussion is timing. Unlike artists who lost housing after fame faded, Carter faced homelessness before recognition arrived. His experience exposes a different failure point in the system, one where aspiring artists receive no structural support during their most vulnerable stages. Without family wealth, safety nets, or industry mentorship, many talented individuals are filtered out before they are ever seen. Today, Carter is housed, working, and publicly respected. Yet he consistently emphasizes that success did not erase the trauma of instability. The fear of losing shelter, the humiliation of being unseen, and the psychological toll of survival do not disappear simply because circumstances improve. Terrell Carter's life challenges the assumption that homelessness is the result of failure. In reality, it is often the result of absence of support, opportunity, and protection. His story reminds us that behind many successful careers are chapters that were never supposed to be survived. Remembering Terrell Carter within the context of housing instability is not about dramatization, it is about truth. His journey proves that talent can exist without safety, and that resilience often forms long before recognition arrives. Michelle Lay. Michelle Lay is a rare case in music history. A woman whose voice helped define an era, yet whose personal life was shaped by silence, control, and instability behind closed doors. Rising in the late 1980s as one of the most distinctive voices in West Coast R&B, Michelle became known for her high-pitched, childlike singing style, an unexpected contrast to the hard-edged hip-hop sound that surrounded her. Her breakthrough came in 1989 with the hit single, No More Lies, which reached number 7 on the Billboard Hot 100 and became a staple of late 80s radio. Signed to Ruthless Records, Michelle was closely associated with Dr. Dre and later Suge Knight, two of the most powerful figures in the emerging hip-hop industry. On the surface, she appeared protected, successful, and financially secure. The reality was far darker. Behind the success, Michelle was living in an environment marked by severe domestic abuse, manipulation, and emotional isolation. In later interviews, she described years of violence at the hands of both Dre and Knight, claims that Dre publicly acknowledged in 2015, apologizing for his past behavior. At the time, however, Michelle had little power, no independent management, and limited control over her finances or career decisions. As her commercial momentum slowed in the early 1990s, her situation deteriorated rapidly. Despite being associated with massively profitable labels, Michelle found herself without stable support. According to her own accounts, there were periods when she experienced housing insecurity, moving between temporary living situations and lacking a safe, permanent place to stay. While she was not consistently living on the streets, she also did not have reliable shelter or protection, especially while attempting to escape abusive relationships. What makes Michele's story especially revealing is how invisible her suffering was to the public. The industry continued to market toughness and excess, while ignoring the reality of a woman being harmed behind the scenes. Financial instability was compounded by medical challenges. Michele later revealed she was born with partial hearing loss, a condition that went untreated for years and affected both her personal and professional life. Unlike many artists whose housing instability stems from addiction or financial mismanagement, Michele's vulnerability was rooted in control and exploitation. Her income, housing, and safety were tied to men who held power over her career. When that power dynamic collapsed, she was left without a safety net. Another example of how women in the music industry, particularly Black women, were often unprotected once they stopped being profitable. In later years, Michele gradually rebuilt her life. She pursued healing, addressed her health needs, and reconnected with music on her own terms. Her story gained renewed attention through documentaries and biographical portrayals, finally giving her space to speak in her own voice rather than being spoken for. Michele is still alive today, and her survival itself is part of her legacy. Her story challenges the assumption that proximity to power equals security. Fame did not protect her. Money did not protect her. Silence was expected, but survival required breaking it. Remembering Michele within the context of housing instability is not about scandal. It is about recognizing how abuse, exploitation, and industry neglect can strip even successful artists of safety. Her life stands as a reminder that homelessness and instability are not always visible, and that sometimes the most dangerous place to be is inside a system that refuses to protect you. Alexander O'Neal. Alexander O'Neal is remembered as one of the most powerful and expressive voices of 1980s R&B. Yet his journey reveals how quickly success can unravel when personal struggles collide with an unforgiving industry. Born in 1953 in Mississippi and raised in Minnesota, O'Neal grew up surrounded by gospel and soul music, developing a commanding vocal style rooted in church tradition. His voice, gritty, emotional, and unmistakably masculine, set him apart during a decade dominated by polished pop. O'Neal rose to prominence after signing with Taboo Records under the guidance of legendary producers Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. His 1985 self-titled debut album launched him into stardom, followed by hits such as Fake, If You Were Here Tonight, and Criticize. Throughout the mid to late 1980s, Alexander O'Neal became a staple on R&B charts, selling millions of records and touring internationally. At his peak, he embodied success, radio dominance, television appearances, and financial comfort. However, behind the scenes, O'Neal struggled with severe substance abuse, particularly cocaine. Addiction began to erode his reliability, health, and decision-making, eventually straining relationships with labels, collaborators, and management. As the 1990s approached and musical trends shifted, his commercial momentum slowed, opportunities diminished, and the industry that once celebrated him moved on with little concern for his well-being. Financial instability soon followed. In interviews, O'Neal openly admitted that there were moments when he was close to homelessness, relying on friends, short-term living arrangements, and informal support systems to survive. While he did not consistently live on the streets, his situation reflected serious housing insecurity, a dramatic contrast to the global success he had achieved just years earlier. The erosion of income, combined with addiction and lack of long-term planning, placed him in a precarious position. What makes Alexander O'Neal's story particularly important is his willingness to speak honestly about his decline. Rather than hiding behind nostalgia, he acknowledged that addiction nearly cost him everything: career, health, and stability. His experience highlights how fame often disguises vulnerability, and how the music industry rarely intervenes once an artist's commercial value fades. In later years, O'Neal took steps toward recovery and rebuilding. He returned to performing, particularly in Europe, where his music retained a loyal audience. Though he never fully regained his former chart dominance, he re-established stability through touring and personal accountability. His voice, aged but still commanding, became a symbol of survival rather than excess. Alexander O'Neal is still alive today, living with the lessons of his past. His story challenges the assumption that chart success guarantees long-term security. In reality, it often masks unresolved struggles until the support disappears. Remembering Alexander O'Neal within the context of housing instability is not about diminishing his achievements. It is about acknowledging the full truth of an artist who gave everything to his craft and nearly lost everything in return. His life reminds us that talent opens doors, but without support, guidance, and care, those doors can close just as fast. These artists didn't lack talent, discipline, or impact. What they lacked was protection. Their voices built empires, yet when addiction, abuse, or financial collapse arrived, the system turned away. The real debate isn't whether they made mistakes, it's whether the industry should abandon the people who made it rich. If icons can lose housing, security, and dignity, what does fame really mean? Were these downfalls personal failures or institutional neglect? Let us know what you think below. Say their names, share your perspective, and keep this conversation alive with Black excellence legends, because silence is how history repeats itself.